They saw a black man in an old hoodie. They didn't see the billion-dollar company he built. They heard his quiet voice asking about a necklace. They didn't hear the unspoken promise he made to his dying mother. And when they laughed at him, when they mocked, whispered, and dismissed him, they thought they were humiliating a nobody. What they didn't know, they were writing the first lines of a story that would go viral, change an entire industry, and leave their luxury showroom empty by nightfall. This is not just a story about wealth, not just a story about race. It's a story about what happens when quiet love meets loud prejudice, and the choice to answer hate not with anger, but with power. He walked into the diamond store for one reason, to buy his mother a necklace she'd wanted since he was a boy. She was dying now, weeks left, maybe days. He could have sent an assistant, ordered online, but love, real love, walks in person, stands in line, and chooses the necklace itself. Outside, his car idled unnoticed, an understated luxury sedan, not a limousine. Inside, the sales associates barely looked up. They were used to certain kinds of customers, the ones in designer suits, the ones dripping with obvious money. Not this man, in a dark hoodie, worn jeans, scuffed shoes from running between hospital visits. They didn't see the CEO of an award-winning tech firm. They didn't see the man Forbes had named among the most influential black business leaders of the decade. They saw only what they wanted to see, and so they laughed. What happened next was caught by security cameras, leaked online, and watched by millions. But the cameras missed what mattered most, the story behind the story. Why he didn't walk out in anger, why he stayed, and why, an hour later, the same sales team stood frozen as he quietly bought every diamond in the store, locked the doors, and transformed the business overnight. This isn't just a viral video. This is a blueprint of what happens when prejudice meets patience, and what dignity can do when it refuses to bow to mockery. Before there were boardrooms, quarterly reports, or headlines calling him a genius, there was just a boy with big eyes and quiet dreams, growing up in a neighborhood where luxury was something glimpsed only on flickering TV screens and magazine covers that never quite felt real. His mother was the constant, a woman of iron will and gentle voice. She worked 2 jobs and sometimes 3, scrubbing offices by night and serving tables by day. The money she made rarely stayed with her. It went to keep the lights on, to keep his school books new enough that he wouldn't feel ashamed in class, to buy a second-hand computer when his fascination with circuits wouldn't fade. But it wasn't just the sacrifice that shaped him, was the belief. She told him, over cracked dinner plates and late-night talks, that he was meant for something larger than what their zip code suggested. And even as bills piled on the kitchen table, she repeated it so often, so firmly, that he dared to believe it too. Then there was the chain. It wasn't much, a thin gold necklace she bought him for his 13th birthday. She'd saved quarters from coffee tips and ironed wrinkled dollar bills until they lay flat, just to afford it. When she clasped it around his neck, her hands trembled a little, as if she feared it might break under the weight of hope. He wore it every day, not because it was worth much, but because it carried a promise, a reminder of where he came from, and a silent vow to carry her dreams as his own. In the mirror, the boy saw 2 things, his reflection, and behind it, her reflection, the woman, who taught him that real wealth wasn't counted in dollars or diamonds, but in the quiet, stubborn love that refused to give up. Long before the world called him CEO, long before he signed checks with more zeros than he'd once thought possible, he was her son. And that, more than any title, was who he truly was. It happened on a night so ordinary, he could barely recall what they'd eaten for dinner, but he remembered her cough, a dry, stubborn sound that had lingered for weeks, growing louder when she thought he was asleep. One night, unable to ignore it any longer, he pushed open the door to her tiny bedroom. The walls were bare except for a fading family photo, and on the nightstand sat a bottle of cough syrup, nearly empty. She tried to laugh it off, her voice hoarse. Just the weather, she whispered. But in that moment, he saw the truth behind her tired eyes, the fear she had buried under years of sacrifice. They didn't talk about hospitals or medical bills. They both knew what they couldn't afford, so instead, they shared a silence heavier than words. In that silence, he made a promise, not out loud, but deep in the marrow of his bones. If success ever came, she would have it too. She would taste the comfort she'd spent her life giving to him, and where the beauty she'd been told wasn't hers to claim. She had spent years convincing him he belonged in every room. Now, he swore to prove it, not just to the world, but to her. The necklace she'd given him lay warm against his chest, as if carrying her heartbeat. He touched it, eyes closed, and imagined another chain, thicker, brighter, heavy with diamonds, not because wealth mattered to her, but because he wanted her to feel cherished the way she had made him feel, protected. It wasn't about luxury, it was about love, transformed into something she could see, touch, and wear proudly. That night, as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, he sat by the window, city lights reflecting in his eyes, and in that quiet hour, he built the first blueprint of a dream, a diamond necklace for the woman who taught him to believe in impossible things. Even as a child, he noticed certain doors stayed shut for people who looked like him. The high-end boutiques where the staff's smiles tightened the moment his mother stepped inside. the polished jewelry counters where sales associates pretended not to see them, and the glossy brochures that never showed faces like theirs. He remembered walking downtown, past display windows shimmering with diamonds, holding his mother's hand as she guided him quickly past, head lowered. Her eyes flickered with longing, but her steps never slowed. "We're not their kind of customers, baby," she'd whisper, as though apologizing for a crime she hadn't committed. At school, classmates boasted about weekend shopping trips, their mothers emerging from boutiques with delicate bags tied in satin ribbons. He'd stay silent, swallowing envy and shame until they settled like stones in his stomach. In college, when he first began making real money from small tech gigs, he dared to step into one of those stores alone. The chandeliers above sparkled, but the air felt cold as marble. The clerk, without so much as a greeting, asked, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" He left empty-handed, burning with humiliation and anger, not because they doubted his wallet, but because they dismissed his worth. Again and again, doors that opened effortlessly for others seemed to weigh tons when he tried to push them. Each rejection didn't kill his dream, but forged it into something harder, sharper. One day, he wouldn't just walk through those doors. He would stand inside them, unapologetically, and choose what to buy, not beg for permission to belong. In late-night hours, building code, chasing funding, and weathering the loneliness of ambition, that vision stayed with him, his mother, standing proudly in a store that had once refused them, a clerk draping a diamond necklace around her neck, and no one daring to ask if she could afford it. Those doors had stayed closed for too long, but if his plan succeeded, he wouldn't just open them. He would hold them wide for her, and for every woman who had been told, "You're not our kind of customer." Success, when it came, arrived quietly at first. A new contract, a growing client list, the first million that felt both surreal and strangely insufficient. Then came the accolades, magazine interviews, and the cautious respect of peers who had once doubted him, yet in quiet moments late at night, laptop glowing in a dark apartment, he felt a dull emptiness gnawing under the triumph. The numbers in his account grew, but the ache in his chest remained. Every pitch deck, every sleepless coding sprint, every calculated risk had started with a single vision, his mother, eyes brimming with tears of gratitude, wearing the necklace he'd place around her neck. A necklace that wasn't just metal and stone, but a symbol. "You belong here. You always did." Yet years flew by, and he kept putting it off. There was always another milestone to hit, another deal to secure, another fear whispering, "What if it's not enough?" He poured millions into product launches, office expansions, and industry events, but hesitated to step back into the boutique world that had once made him feel small. Sometimes, when he visited his mother, he noticed her jewelry box, a modest wooden case, its hinges slightly rusted. Inside were only a few pieces, none worth much by the world's standards, but priceless to her because of the stories they carried. She never asked for diamonds. Her love had always been unconditional, her pride in him unshakable, no matter what adorned her neck. Still, he couldn't let go of that vision. It wasn't about the diamonds. It was about rewriting the ending of a story that had started with humiliation, about turning a moment of shame into a legacy of love. So he made a decision. He would walk into the most exclusive diamond store he could find, not as the uncertain young man of years past, but as the CEO he had become, the son determined to honor his mother's quiet strength. He booked the flight, cleared his calendar, and spent a sleepless night rehearsing what he would say if someone dared question his place. The next morning, as dawn painted the city in soft gold, he dressed in his usual style, simple but elegant, nothing flashy. He checked his reflection, saw confidence mixed with the scars of past slights, and whispered to himself, "For her." The doors he'd once been too afraid to touch were now within reach, and this time, he wouldn't let anyone close them in his face. Morning came wrapped in a strange calm, not the kind that erases nerves, but the kind that steals them. He woke before sunrise. City lights still blinking against the fading night, a cold splash of water across his face, the steady inhale and exhale that had centered him before every major pitch. But this wasn't a boardroom. This was personal. As he dressed, his mind played old scenes on repeat. That day outside the boutique, when laughter had pierced deeper than any insult, his mother's soft voice insisting she didn't need gifts, and the countless meetings where he'd felt eyes measuring him for the wrong reasons. Yet today, he decided, those voices wouldn't decide who he was. The sleek suit he chose wasn't armor, it was a quiet declaration. "I have earned my place, and I bring it with me wherever I go." The necklace design lived vividly in his mind, a string of diamonds, delicate but undeniably elegant, something that would rest against his mother's heart, catching the light when she smiled. Outside his window, the city began to stir. Delivery trucks rumbled down narrow streets, steam curled from coffee carts, and pedestrians started their daily march. Unaware that someone among them was ready to close an old wound, he left his penthouse carrying nothing but his phone and purpose. No assistant, no entourage, just a son on a mission. As he walked through the lobby, a concierge offered the polite, polished greeting reserved for important guests. He nodded back, silently remembering the days he would have checked his reflection. a dozen times, worried about appearing respectable enough. Now, every step felt deliberate, past doormen, past rushing commuters, past curious glances. His reflection in the passing windows showed more than expensive fabric. It showed years of late nights, near collapse, and quiet resilience. Each wrinkle around his eyes, each line of tension in his jaw, all part of a story written in persistence. Near the store, he paused to breathe in the morning air, crisp, almost sharp. Across the street, the diamond store windows glittered, facets catching the sun, shimmering promises of luxury. But what mattered wasn't the price tags behind the glass. It was what those diamonds would become, a tribute to a woman whose love never required proof, yet deserved the world in return. His hand tightened around the door handle. One deep breath, and then the slow push forward. Today, he wasn't the boy they had laughed at. He was the man they would remember. The door chimed softly as he stepped inside. A faint scent of polished marble and expensive cologne floated. In the air, the familiar perfume of old money. Behind glass counters lay rows of diamonds, each sparkling like caged light. Luxury was everywhere. Velvet display trays, gold-trimmed mirrors, and spotlights that made every gemstone dance. But the luxury ended where human warmth should have begun. The staff glanced up, quick flickers of recognition followed by practiced, polite indifference, and then just under the surface, something colder. A sales associate, lips pressed into a thin line, stepped forward. She scanned his shoes, his suit, and finally his face, her eyes hardening almost imperceptibly. "Can I help you?" she asked, tone edged with forced courtesy. A question that sounded less like an offer and more like a challenge. "What are you doing here?" He knew that tone well. He'd heard it at airports, at exclusive clubs, at private investor summits where introductions paused when his skin color registered. A pause so brief most people missed it, but never him. He offered a calm smile. "I'm looking for a diamond necklace," he said evenly, "something elegant." "For my mother?" The associate nodded mechanically, but her eyes darted to a colleague. That colleague smirked, barely hiding it, as if the very idea of him shopping there was amusing. They guided him slowly, toward a far corner of the showroom. Not the grand center displays reserved for real clients, but a side case, with smaller, less spectacular pieces. It was subtle, almost professional, almost, yet the message was clear. "We'll serve you, but on our terms." He felt the old sting, sharp and familiar, a mix of anger, sadness, and weary resignation. The knowledge that even after all his success, he could still be measured first by the color of his skin. For a moment, he thought of walking out. Why reward them? Why stay? Then, he remembered. This wasn't about them. This was about her, his mother, who had taught him never to let someone else's prejudice shrink his spirit. So he stayed. He let them see his patience, his calm. He let them mistake it for weakness. All while inside, something older and stronger was waking, not rage, but resolve, because they didn't realize the kind of man standing before them. And soon, they would. They showed him necklaces with small stones, their voices dripping with hollow sales talk. Perhaps something more modest, one suggested, glancing quickly at his wristwatch as if counting the minutes until he'd leave. He turned each piece gently in his hand, the diamonds dull compared to the vision in his mind. A vision of his mother, lying in a hospital bed, tired but smiling, still proud of him, still stronger than anyone he'd ever known. She had always loved diamonds, not for their price but for what they symbolized. Light captured in stone, resilience under pressure, beauty forged through unimaginable force. The saleswoman kept talking, her words blurring into background noise. He barely heard her. Instead, he heard his mother's voice. "Years ago, when they see your skin, before they see your soul, don't prove them wrong with anger, prove them wrong with excellence." His jaw tightened. This visit was never meant to be a statement. He had simply wanted to buy a gift to bring a moment of joy to a woman who had spent her life giving everything to others. But now it had to be more, not just a purchase, not just a necklace. It had to become a message that no one, not even the keepers of polished glass and rare stones, would ever make him feel small again. He straightened his shoulders and let out a slow breath, his decision hardening like carbon into diamond. "Thank you," he said, politely setting down the necklace. "I'd like to see your finest collection, please." The smirk on the associate's face twitched, threatened to vanish, but it stayed. "We usually show that only to preferred clients," she replied carefully. He nodded once. "I understand," he said. "Perhaps your manager could assist me." Then, something in his tone, calm, quiet, but immovable, startled her. For the first time, the laughter in her eyes faltered. She hesitated, and in that hesitation, he saw the first crack in their perfect facade. The request summoned a shift in the air, a ripple through marble floors and chandelier light. Moments later, the manager arrived, tailored suit, crisp, shoes whispering across polished stone. A man who'd spent years curating an image of quiet control. "Good afternoon, sir," the manager greeted, his practiced smile almost convincing. "I understand you'd like to see our exclusive collection." "Yes," the black CEO replied calmly. "I'm shopping for my mother. She's unwell, and I want something worthy of her strength." The manager nodded, lips parting for a polite response, but his gaze flicked, almost unconsciously, to the CEO's sneakers, the simple watch on his wrist, a silent calculation behind his eyes, and though the words that followed were smooth, the moment before them had spoken louder. "Course, please follow me," the manager said, leading him through a glass door to a quieter part of the showroom, a space reserved for clients whose worth was assumed, never questioned. Inside, the lighting softened to a golden warmth. Diamonds, larger and clearer, rested on velvet as if floating on clouds. Here, the walls themselves seemed to breathe in hushed reverence, every detail crafted to remind a visitor they were in the presence of something beyond price. But even in this sanctuary of luxury, the chill of doubt still lingered, an unspoken question, hanging heavy as crystal chandeliers. Does he belong here? The black CEO felt it, felt the centuries layered into every suspicious glance, felt the weight of history in the silence between polite words. Yet he stood straighter, voice steady. "I'd like to see the most exquisite pieces you have," he said. The manager hesitated, fingers brushing a locked drawer, a choice behind every breath, to honor the customer before him, or the prejudice that whispered he could not possibly afford what he asked for. At last, the manager unlocked the drawer and placed 3 necklaces on the counter. Each stone shimmered with cold, perfect fire. They were not offered so much as displayed a test, an unspoken dare. The black CEO did not blink. He studied each piece, not with the desperation of a man trying to prove himself, but with the measured curiosity of someone who knew the value of what he saw. He could sense the staff shifting at the edges of the room, their laughter now replaced by something else. Cautious attention, edged with disbelief. They waited for him to flinch at the price tags, to reveal, in a single, startled breath, that he didn't belong here, but he did not. Instead, he lifted his gaze to the manager. "How much for all 3? He asked, voice calm as still water. The question hung in the air, pulling every breath in the showroom toward it. Even the diamonds seemed to shimmer differently under the weight of those words. "How much for all 3? The manager's practice.com slipped, just for a heartbeat. He blinked, the polite mask faltering before duty forced it back into place. But something had changed, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. "These are among our most exclusive pieces," he began, voice softer, suddenly careful. "Together, they come to just over $2.5 million. Around them, the room seemed to hush itself further. Sales associates, once content to whisper among themselves, now leaned subtly closer, ears straining to catch the response. Even the quiet tick of the wall clock felt louder. $2.5 million. A number spoken not to inform, but to challenge. A number meant to separate the real from the pretenders. But the black CEO didn't flinch. He neither laughed it off nor bristled in offense. He nodded, eyes lingering on the stones, as if calculating not just their price, but the stories they might tell around his mother's fragile neck. "Very well," he said at last. "I'll take them." The words landed in the room like a stone, dropped into still water. Ripples of shock moved outward across the manager's controlled expression, through the frozen smiles of the staff, and into the mirrored walls that reflected disbelief back. "ATHOUSANDFOLD. The manager cleared his throat. "Would you prefer to place a deposit and complete the purchase later?" His voice strained, caught between protocol and the disbelief, still tugging at the edge of his mind. "No," the CEO answered quietly. "I'd like to pay in full, right now." His tone wasn't loud. It didn't need to be, because power, real power, rarely raises its voice. Behind them, the laughter of minutes ago felt impossibly distant. The mocking smiles had drained into silent awe, as if someone had pulled the color out of the air. A few staff members exchanged glances, the shock in their eyes giving way to a different question. Who is this man? They had written their story of him the moment he stepped in. Simple clothes, weary eyes, a request that sounded too grand. They thought they knew, but now, faced with reality, that story crumbled, and all that remained was curiosity, and something unspoken, almost like regret. The CEO pulled out his phone, fingers moving with calm precision. His bank confirmed the transfer in seconds. No hesitation, no haggling, no self-congratulation. As if spending millions on diamonds was no different than picking up a loaf of bread, the receipt printed slowly, its tiny motor humming loud in the hush. When the manager handed it over, their fingers almost touched, and in that moment, the manager seemed to realize he had been on the wrong side of this story all along. But the CEO didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Power had revealed itself, not through anger or insult, but through quiet certainty. And now, it was too late for anyone to pretend they hadn't seen it. When the transaction was done, the silence in the diamond store became a presence of its own. It pressed against the glass cases, curled around the velvet trays, and settled on the shoulders of every person watching. The black CEO stood quietly, his eyes on the diamonds now packed into small, elegant boxers. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He simply existed, fully, confidently, in a space that had moments earlier rejected him. Behind the counters, the staff shifted awkwardly. A few pretended to straighten displays, others fiddled with tablets whose screens they barely saw. But the laughter from earlier had evaporated, replaced by a realization too uncomfortable to say aloud. They had mocked a man whose wealth and resolve outmatched the entire store, but it wasn't the money alone that weighed on them now. It was something deeper, the recognition that they had exposed themselves. Their prejudice had slipped out raw, unfiltered, and it had been met not with rage, but with absolute, undeniable success. The manager, who had moments ago questioned the CEO's request, found words sticking in his throat. A polite thank you felt too small, an apology too risky, an admission of guilt. So instead, he offered the safe refuge of corporate language. Thank you for your purchase, sir. We hope these bring joy to your family. The CEO finally lifted his gaze, locking eyes with the man who had doubted him. He nodded, slow, deliberate, a gesture that carried neither forgiveness nor anger, but something in between, a silent acknowledgement of what had just transpired. Outside the store's tinted glass, pedestrians moved along the sidewalk, unaware of the drama that had played out minutes ago. But inside, time felt thick, like syrup. Everyone waited for him to speak, to say something that would release them from the grip of shame and wonder. But he didn't, and in his silence lay the sharpest lesson of all. In the far corner, one young employee swallowed hard. She remembered the look on the CEO's face when they first questioned his purchase, not rage, but something almost like disappointment. It was the look of a man who had seen this too many times before. For a moment, guilt bit into her. Then came a softer thought, quieter but clearer. Maybe this is the moment I change. Around them, the diamonds continued to sparkle under perfect lighting, but now they seemed different, symbols not only of wealth, but of how quickly judgment can turn into humiliation. The CEO tucked the receipt into his pocket. No flourish, no dramatic exit. He simply turned toward the door. Boxers secured, posture straight, and as he stepped toward the threshold, the store itself seemed to exhale, as if it had been holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. Beneath the elegant lighting and soft music, his mind played an entirely different soundtrack, the relentless hum of self-doubt, sharpened by years of coded slights and outright contempt. He had fought so hard to become immune to these subtle wounds, to keep his spirit wrapped in the armor of confidence. Yet in that moment, standing in the hush of a diamond boutique, the old ache returned with startling sharpness. The laughter from across the store, brief, hushed, but unmistakable, wasn't loud, yet it echoed inside him like a drumbeat. Their amusement wasn't really about the clothes he wore or the shoes that had touched dusty sidewalks outside. It was about the quiet message that a man like him, in a place like this, must surely be out of place. He recognized the look of forced politeness that cracked too easily, revealing the sneer beneath. That was a language he had learned to read long ago. But beneath the sting of mockery, pride rose up, fierce and undimmed. Not the hollow pride of stubborn denial, but the solid lived-in pride of a man who had built himself from the ground up, whose worth could not be measured in glances or whispered jokes. It was a pride shaped by long nights and longer doubts, by risks taken when failure meant not just a lost investment but the confirmation of every cruel stereotype hurled his way. In that quiet defiance, the memory of his mother surfaced again, not as a ghost of sorrow, but as a voice of challenge. She had taught him, gently yet relentlessly, that his dignity was not theirs to grant or withhold, that no fine stone, no polished floor, no glass case could define his value. It wasn't enough to want justice, she had once said. You had to live it, walk it, and, when necessary, buy it outright. So while part of him longed to turn and walk away, to leave them to their assumptions and their laughter, another part refused to surrender the ground. That was the price of pride. Not always comfort, but the willingness to carry discomfort if it meant refusing to shrink. It was a lesson learned painfully over decades, refined with each new insult endured and each new success earned despite them. As he drew a measured breath, the air itself seemed to shift around him. The jewelry no longer glittered as distant trophies, but as silent witnesses to a decision he had yet to fully make. And in that moment, he realized the choice ahead was larger than necklaces and diamonds. It was about rewriting the narrative they had already written for him, turning their laughter into the quiet shock of disbelief, the kind that lingers long after the door closes behind you. That choice, he knew, would come at a cost. But it was a cost he was finally ready to pay. He stood there, letting the silence stretch and settle like a velvet curtain drawn over an unfinished painting. In that hush, he could almost hear the pulse of the room itself. The low hum of refrigerated cases, the distant rhythm of footsteps across marble, the barely audible exhalations of staff too used to quick judgments and even quicker dismissals. It was tempting to react, to answer the laughter and the hidden smirks with open confrontation, but years in boardrooms, on investment calls, and at negotiations where the stakes were measured in millions had taught him the value of calculated silence. Silence could be mistaken for weakness, but it was just as often the space where power gathered itself before being revealed. In those moments, his mind traveled back through time to recall countless meetings where he had sat at polished tables, the only black man in the room, forced to prove not just his plan but his very right to be there. The skill of waiting, of not flinching under scrutiny, had been hard-won, and it had saved him more than once. As he stood unmoving before the glass case, he let them write their unspoken story. The underdressed man who surely couldn't afford anything here, whose presence must be a mistake, or, at best, a curiosity. Their quiet dismissal was almost comforting in its familiarity. It confirmed what he already knew about the world he had spent his life navigating. But beneath that surface calm, the quiet roared. It wasn't anger in its rawest form. It was something cooler, older, and more strategic. It was the memory of every dismissed idea later proven brilliant, every closed door forced open by perseverance and proof. That cold fire had carried him from nothing to everything, and in this moment, it burned with a particular clarity. He knew that their surprise would not come from his words. It would come from his actions, deliberate, decisive, and impossible to ignore. They would remember the day not for the laughter they shared but for the silence that followed, when realization dawned too late to call back their assumptions. For now, though he held the silence close, a quiet reservoir of power, it would serve him better than any quick retort. It would speak loudest when the time came to act, and he already knew that time was coming soon. As he waited, letting the quiet stretch, his thoughts turned inward, away from the glittering diamonds and the judgmental eyes that barely disguised their scorn. Instead, he thought of why he was really here. Not to prove anything to them, though the temptation always lingered, but for someone whose strength had shaped his own. His mother, a woman who had weathered indignities that made this moment feel trivial by comparison, who had taught him that quiet dignity could be as sharp as any blade, and that success was not merely what one accumulated, but what one chose to do with it. He remembered her hands, strong but worn, guiding him through childhood storms no one else saw. Remembered the nights she worked 2 jobs so he could dream beyond the boundaries drawn by other people's expectations. And now, as illness shadowed her final years, he felt the weight of wanting to give her something that transcended material worth, a gift that said, "I see you. I honor everything you sacrificed." In that moment, the diamonds stopped being status symbols. They became something gentler, almost sacred, a tribute to love forged in hardship. He wasn't here to challenge strangers or even to humble them, though he suspected that might happen anyway. He was here because his story had been built on her shoulders, and he wanted her to know, in some tangible way, that none of it was forgotten. He wondered how many of the laughing staff had ever felt that kind of responsibility, the deep, sometimes aching gratitude that outlives pride. How many had understood that success, when rooted in legacy, becomes less about what you own and more about what you owe. That quiet reflection steadied him further. Their smirks faded in importance. The store itself, with its cold marble and calculated sparkle, was just a setting. The real story was older, deeper, a son honoring his mother. And in that truth there was nothing to defend and nothing to prove. He let out a slow breath, his gaze lingering on the necklace he'd chosen, the one he hoped would carry his love, his gratitude, and his unspoken apology for all the times ambition kept him away. A gift not from a wealthy man, but from a son who remembered where he came from. And if in the process he exposed the pettiness of those who underestimated him, so be it. But that was never the real reason he came. The real reason lay far beyond the judgment of strangers, rooted in a bond no price tag could capture. The longer he stood there, the more the noise of the sales floor blurred into a dull hum. The laughter that once pierced like glass now felt distant, almost irrelevant. It was as though the walls of the store had receded, leaving only him, the necklace, and the memory of why this mattered. In that quiet, his resolve crystallized. Idea had first come as a flicker, a reaction to the mockery, but had grown into something larger, a statement, not shouted, but enacted. He would buy not just the necklace, but every diamond in the case. Not from anger, though anger had once sparked the thought, but from a deeper conviction that actions spoke louder than explanations. It wouldn't erase the insult. It wouldn't force them to see him as anything but what they chose to see. But it would make the cost of their bias clear, in a language they could not ignore. Economics, and it would turn this small, bitter moment into something far greater, a story that would travel farther than their laughter ever could. He thought of how often he'd walked away in silence, how often he'd chosen dignity over confrontation. This time, silence would not mean surrender. This time, it would mean power wielded gracefully, without theatrics, without a raised voice, a quiet correction to an old and stubborn prejudice. His gaze moved across the velvet displays. Each stone had been cut, polished, and set by unseen hands destined to glitter under perfect lights. But beneath the surface, each diamond carried flaws, invisible to the casual eye, yet part of its very identity. And in that imperfection lay authenticity, even beauty. He saw something of himself in those stones, shaped by pressure, carrying unseen scars, yet unbroken, more valuable because of what he had endured, not despite it. With a single nod, he signaled to the bewildered clerk. His voice, calm and steady, broke the momentary hush. "I'll take them all," he said. "Every piece you have." The clerk's face shifted from disbelief to confusion, then to thinly veiled calculation. Around them, the laughter died, replaced by a sharp, almost reverent silence. The room seemed to contract, every gaze drawn to him. The man they had dismissed as unworthy, now rewriting the narrative with a single sentence. He felt no triumph, only a quiet certainty. This wasn't revenge. It was revelation, a demonstration that worth cannot be measured by appearance, and that true power often arrives softly, without a raised voice or a clenched fist. In that, the room belonged to him, and while their eyes widened, while the air thickened with realization, he thought only of his mother, and how, when he placed the necklace in her hands, it would mean more than all the scorn in the world, because dignity, once chosen, becomes its own kind of victory, and in that silent decision, he had already won. Long before the luxury storefronts, before the tailored suits and polished confidence, he had learned his first lesson in worth, taught not by a mentor in a boardroom, but by his mother at the edge of their modest kitchen table. He remembered the late evenings when the city outside turned, quiet and shadows crept across the linoleum floor. His mother would sit across from him, her tired eyes softened by love, and talk about things that seemed impossibly large to a boy barely tall enough to see out the window. People will see what they want to see, she had told him once, her voice low but steady, but don't ever let that become what you see in yourself. It was a simple sentence, but in those words lived a truth that had carried him farther than degrees or titles ever could. Over the years, he had learned to let judgments fall like rain, never denying their sting, but refusing to let them soak into the fabric of who he was. He had watched her, too, how she moved through rooms where she wasn't always welcomed, how her shoulders squared even when whispers followed. She had never owned fine jewelry. The only adornment she wore daily was quiet resilience, wrapped around her like an heirloom scarf. It was from her that he understood the difference between pride and dignity. Pride can be loud, a shield held high. Dignity is quieter, forged in private moments when no one else is watching. Now, standing in that diamond store, with the weight of sneers still lingering in the air, he felt the echo of her words as if she were beside him. He thought of her frail hands, of the illness that had stolen her strength but not her spirit, and how even now she insisted on sitting up when he visited, insisting on greeting him as though nothing had changed. In her eyes he had never been a suit, a title, or a bank account. He had been, and would always be, her child. Worthy from the moment he drew breath. As he considered the diamonds before him, he didn't see luxury or symbols of power. He saw an offering, a tribute to the woman who had built his sense of self with words softer than velvet and stronger than stone. That memory steadied him. The laughter, the mockery, they belonged to a different story, one written by people too bound by their assumptions to see beyond them. His story, however, began at a worn kitchen table, across from a woman whose quiet lessons had outlasted every insult and every locked door. And as he prepared to buy the diamonds that others thought beyond his reach, it wasn't to prove them wrong, it was to honor the first person who had ever told him he was enough. After the laughter faded, the store seemed to settle into a tense quiet, yet that silence carried its own heavy language, heavier, perhaps, than the words that had come before. It was the hush that often followed an uncomfortable moment, when the air itself seemed embarrassed by what had happened. Sales associates rearranged trays and pretended to check inventory, their eyes carefully avoiding his. The manager, who had once watched him with amused condescension, now shifted behind the counter, face tight with uncertainty. It was a silence he had known many times before, in corporate boardrooms when his ideas were met with polite nods, but later repeated by someone else, suddenly received as brilliant at private events, where name tags mattered less than skin tones, and conversation turned icy the moment he introduced himself as CEO, on airplanes, in lobbies, even waiting for elevators. Always that subtle, cold pause that seemed to say, "You don't quite belong here." But silence could be a teacher too. In it, he had discovered the power of stillness, the ability to let others fill the space with their discomfort rather than rushing to comfort them, so he didn't rush to speak. Instead, he let them sit in it. The clerks, the manager, the passing customers who had paused to stare, and now looked away awkwardly. In that pause, his posture told its own story, a man neither embarrassed nor angry, simply waiting as though he had every right to stand there. Every right to take up space, every right to decide what happened next. Years ago, he might have lowered his gaze, eager to end the discomfort, but experience had taught him that doing so never really spared anyone. It only taught them that the silence would be filled for them, that someone like him would always be the one to shrink. So instead, he let the moment stretch, let it become undeniable. Let them see their laughter turn to confusion, confusion to anxiety, and anxiety to a realization they couldn't quite name, that maybe they had misread him. And in that wordless span of time, a shift began, small, but unmistakable. A few associates moved nervously, stealing glances toward the manager. The laughter that had seemed so confident minutes ago now felt brittle, almost absurd in retrospect. He had learned over years in countless rooms that power wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it lived in quiet refusal, the refusal to justify, to explain, to reassure those who had done harm. And so, as the diamond store settled into that thick, uneasy silence, he stood calmly in its center. Not as a man seeking permission, but as a man deciding what came next. As he stood in that uneasy hush, Memories stirred, quiet but insistent reminders of why he'd walked into this diamond store in the first place. Years ago, when his mother's health had first begun to slip, she would still join him on short walks around their old neighborhood. Even then, with each step becoming a careful negotiation with pain, she carried herself with a grace that never dimmed. On one of those afternoons, they had passed a small jewelry shop with a single delicate diamond necklace in the window. She had paused, her reflection merging with the sparkling glass. And for a moment he had seen in her eyes a gentle longing, not for the luxury itself, but for what it represented: care, celebration, love expressed in something lasting. She had quickly waved it off, half laughing. "Too much for an old woman like me," she'd said. But he had caught the softness in her voice, the way her hand had lingered near the glass before moving away. At the time, his business was just starting. Bills were constant, investors were cautious, and every cent mattered. Yet he'd made himself a quiet promise that day: someday, when I can, I'll buy it for her. Not because she asked, but because she never would. Years passed. His company grew from late nights at a cramped desk into a recognized brand. Profits rose, meetings filled, calendars and invitations to events he had once dreamed of now arrived addressed to CEO. But the promise remained, a private vow folded into the noise of contracts and conferences. Even as his mother's health worsened, and hospital rooms replaced morning walks, the promise stayed with him. And so, on this day, the day he finally felt ready to fulfill it, he found himself here, in a store that had seen only the color of his skin and the simplicity of his clothes. Not the decades of sacrifice and success behind them. The memory steadied him, reminded him that what had happened here wasn't about the necklace itself, or even about the laughter. It was about what he refused to let them take: his right to honor his mother, his story, and the dignity that belonged to both of them. Could mock his coat, doubt his credit, laugh behind polished counters, but they couldn't rewrite the truth of who he was, or why he had come. And standing there in silence, he felt the old promise burn brighter than any diamond in the glass cases around him. Moments like this often hang in a delicate silence, the kind that feels heavier than noise. The laughter had faded, replaced by an uncomfortable quiet that even the soft classical music piping through the store couldn't smooth over. For the staff, realization arrived not as a single thought but as a creeping awareness. First, in the way their smiles faltered. Then, in how their eyes darted to one another, silently questioning, "Did we just go too far?" One of them cleared her throat, as if trying to summon back the practiced tone of luxury hospitality, but the words stuck. The mocking laughter still echoed too loudly in their minds. It's strange how quickly certainty can evaporate. Moments earlier, they had felt sure. The man in the scuffed coat was an inconvenience at best, a joke at worst. But now, something about the way he stood, unmoved, undiminished, unsettled them. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity that held the room like a second gravity, or the calm in his eyes, which seemed to say, "I've endured far worse than your laughter, and I'm still here." They began to notice what they had missed: the way he held himself. Shoulders squared not from arrogance but from resilience, built over years. The watch at his wrist, understated, but unmistakably valuable to those who truly knew. The calmness that comes only from power earned, not borrowed. And slowly, recognition dawned. This is not the man we thought he was. In that moment, the atmosphere inside the diamond store shifted from smug amusement to brittle defensiveness. It was as if the laughter had left behind cracks, and through those cracks, truth had begun to shine. The manager, sensing the change, tried to salvage professionalism. Her voice came out a touch too high-pitched. "Sir, can I help you find something?" But the words, once dripping with condescension, now trembled with the first pangs of regret, didn't rush to answer. The power of silence, something he'd learned in years of boardrooms and negotiations, spoke louder than any immediate reply. And in that silence, the staff began to see what they had really done, not just mocking a customer, but mocking a man who had built a life worthy of respect. A man who had come not to flaunt wealth, but to keep a promise rooted in love. They felt the balance tilt, their certainty crumble, and for the first time, they wished they could take back what had already been said. But words, once spoken, cannot be unsaid, and laughter, once given, cannot be unheard. The man looked past the diamonds for a moment, as if seeing something far beyond glass and carrots. His mother's face flickered in his mind. Warm, gentle, marked by lines of sacrifice, and soft with the memory of lullabies sung late at night. It wasn't about the diamonds themselves, it never had been. It was about what they represented. A final gift to honor the woman who had taught him what real value meant. The woman who had taught him that dignity was not given by others, but built, day by day, choice by choice. He thought of the nights she stayed awake, sewing clothes by lamplight, so he would never feel less than anyone else at school. He remembered her voice telling him, "Walk tall, even when they doubt you," especially then. And how, at his lowest, when doors slammed in his face because of the color of his skin, she would press his hand and say, "Son, you're made of stronger things than they can see." That was the real inheritance, resilience, not resentment. And now, as she lay ill, time running shorter than anyone dared admit. He had vowed to bring her something she had never owned, a diamond necklace that sparkled like her spirit, a piece that would say, without words, "You gave me everything. Let me give you this." In the hush of the store, his resolve only deepened. Their laughter had tried to reduce him to a stereotype. But love, true love, is immune to humiliation, so he raised his eyes and fixed them on the manager. Voice steady. "I'm looking for something special," he said, as if the past few minutes of mockery had never happened. "A necklace. For my mother." The staff hesitated. Their minds still scrambled to reconcile what they saw now with what they had chosen to see minutes earlier. But he had already decided. Their perception no longer mattered. All that mattered was a promise kept, and a mother's smile, that, for a moment, might forget the pain, because in the end, love outlasts laughter. And dignity, once claimed, cannot be taken by shallow scorn. Silence returned to the store, heavier than marble. For a breath, it felt as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. The man slowly moved closer to the glittering cases. To anyone watching, it might have looked like quiet contemplation, but inside, his heart was steeled, calm in its certainty. He was done explaining himself to people who had already chosen not to see him. He pointed to a display, an exquisite necklace, strands of diamonds catching every shard of light. The manager, whose earlier laughter had shriveled into an awkward stiffness, finally spoke. "That piece is quite expensive," he murmured, words faltering under the weight of the moment. The man's gaze didn't waver. "I'll take it," he replied, voice level as the floor beneath them. "And while you're at it, bring out the rest of the collection. I want to see it all." It wasn't bravado. It was a quiet statement of fact. He could afford it, not just financially, but emotionally, because wealth wasn't the source of his power. The real power came from knowing exactly who he was. One by one, trays of diamonds appeared. Staff hands trembled as they set them down, realizing too late how easily they had misjudged the man before them. He surveyed them carefully, thoughtfully, as if he had all the time in the world. And then, almost as an afterthought, he said, words that would echo in that boutique for years to come, "I'll buy them all." The words felt heavy, final, undeniable. A moment that ripped away pretense and left truth exposed like raw stone. They had mocked him as someone small, yet here he stood, reshaping their reality with a single sentence. The staff exchanged glances, eyes wide, panic and disbelief mixing. In a single breath, no apologies came, not yet. But in their faces, an unspoken admission, they had been wrong. And for him, that was enough. Not for revenge, but as proof that the measure of a person is never decided by strangers in silk ties and polished shoes. As the store clerk began to wrap the diamonds, the man thought of his mother. Not of the money spent, but of what these diamonds would mean when she saw them. A declaration. Wordless but clear. "You raised a man who could stand here unshaken." And perhaps, for just that moment, all the pain she carried would weigh a little less. As the final piece was placed in the velvet box, a hush still held the boutique hostage. The laughter that once floated so freely now felt like an offense. Against the heavy truth filling the room, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't look for apologies. Instead, he let the silence do the speaking, the same silence they had offered him moments ago, when they dismissed him as unworthy. The credit card left his wallet with unhurried calm, its black surface catching the overhead lights like a quiet rebuke to every assumption made about him. It wasn't the card itself that mattered. It was the weight of history it carried. Every late night, every door once slammed in his face, every time someone heard his name and saw only what they wanted to see. The transaction processed, approved. A single beep that rang louder than any words ever could. He collected the boxers carefully, his movements deliberate, not rushed, not fueled by anger, but guided by something older, a resolve built from years of being overlooked and underestimated. When he turned to leave, he paused by the main display window. Reflected in the glass, he didn't see just his own figure. He saw every person who'd ever been told you don't belong. And for them, he left behind something more powerful than rage. Proof that quiet dignity could outweigh loud prejudice. Proof that success could be its own reply to mockery. And proof that sometimes, you don't need to raise your voice to change a story, you just need to own it. As the door closed softly behind him, it felt like more than just leaving a store. It felt like stepping beyond every limitation that had ever been whispered at his back. And though the diamonds were destined for his mother, what he truly carried away was invisible. A moment reclaimed, a narrative rewritten, a silent triumph echoing beyond polished glass and marble floors, a promise that history, too, could be changed by one person choosing to stand firm. The next morning, the world woke up to headlines they didn't expect. What began as an ordinary afternoon errand for a devoted son had ignited conversations far beyond the glitter of diamonds. Mainstream media caught wind of the video first. The clip of the black CEO standing silently as laughter echoed around him, then calmly buying out the entire stock, sparked a storm of commentary. Words like humiliation, racism, and justice trended across platforms. It wasn't just about wealth. It was about dignity reclaimed in real time. Talk shows replayed the video on loop. One host pointed out the rawness of the moment. Look at his face. He's not smiling, not gloating. It's not revenge, it's grief turned into power. The narrative struck a chord deeper than mere spectacle. People weren't just reacting to the purchase. They were reacting to the universal sting of being underestimated. The weight of prejudice carried silently for years, until a single spark sets it ablaze. Bloggers wrote long essays. Podcasters dissected every second. His posture, the clerk's smirks, the stunned silence when the transaction cleared. They debated. Was it defiance or a plea for recognition? Was it an act of pride or of pain? For many black entrepreneurs, it felt deeply personal. They saw themselves in him. The forced patience, the quiet calculations, the refusal to be defined by stereotypes. In coffee shops, college dorms, and corporate break rooms, people discussed not just what happened, but why it happened and why it keeps happening. Across continents, millions recognized something they'd felt, but rarely seen, captured so purely. A single man, armed with composure and success, facing an institution of quiet bigotry and answering it without a single insult, only decisive action. The story had gone viral, but it was more than that. It was the spark of a larger conversation that would stretch far beyond a diamond store's marble floor. When the cameras stopped rolling and the receipts were tucked away, he left the store in silence. No entourage followed him, no cheering crowd trailed behind. Just a man walking alone through polished marble floors. The weight of diamonds in a velvet case and the heavier weight of what had just unfolded. Outside, the city felt louder than before. Car horns, hurried footsteps, murmurs from people recognizing him from the viral clip that had already begun spreading like wildfire. But in his mind, it was quiet. He thought of his mother. She had once told him, in a soft voice roughened by years of struggle, that dignity was the most expensive thing anyone could own. As a child, he didn't fully understand. Now every step made the meaning clearer. There was no satisfaction in proving them wrong. No thrill in flexing his bank account to break their assumptions. Instead, there was an ache that this was still necessary, that, in 2025, a black man in a tailored suit could walk into a diamond store and still be mocked as if he didn't belong. His driver waited by the curb, eyes lowered respectfully. No words passed between them as the CEO settled into the back seat, the velvet box resting beside him like a delicate secret. Through the tinted window, he watched the store fade behind him. Its cold glass walls now stood as a symbol of something larger, not just personal insult, but the stubborn persistence of prejudice in places draped in wealth and elegance. He knew the video would keep spreading. He also knew some would reduce it to a viral stunt, a flex, an example of petty revenge. But that wasn't what this was. It was about visibility for every customer ever followed around a store, every professional who'd been doubted because of skin color, every quiet humiliation borne in silence. As traffic lights turned from red to green, the city skyline blurred, and he allowed himself to exhale. He hadn't wanted this to become a spectacle, but maybe, just maybe, the spectacle was what the world needed to see. Later that evening, in the quiet of his penthouse apartment, the diamond box finally left his coat pocket. He placed it gently on the polished mahogany dining table, its deep velvet catching the glow of the city lights pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows. He stood there for a moment, staring at it not as a symbol of wealth, but of something painfully human, proof that even now, love sometimes came wrapped in struggle. He opened the box slowly. Inside, the necklace shimmered with a soft brilliance, a row of carefully set diamonds, delicate yet bold, a piece meant not to impress strangers, but to honor his mother. She wouldn't see the store it came from. She wouldn't hear the laughter that preceded the sale, and he would never tell her, not because it was shameful, but because she had carried enough burdens in her life. This necklace would not be tainted by what had happened. He thought back to childhood, to the tiny apartment they shared, where she taught him the difference between appearing wealthy and being truly rich in spirit. To the nights she came home exhausted from cleaning offices whose owners never bothered to learn her name. To her voice, tired yet patient, telling him to walk taller than the insults people threw his way. He'd bought her other gifts over the years: designer handbags, luxury trips, small tokens of gratitude. But this necklace felt different. Not because it was the most expensive, but because it had cost him more than money. It had cost him a confrontation with a reality that had always been there, lurking beneath polite smiles and "May I help you?" greetings. He closed the box and ran a thumb across its velvet cover. This was not revenge. It was an offering, a promise that the laughter of strangers would not define their story, that even in places meant to exclude, love could still claim its space. Outside, the city kept moving, cars crawling like fireflies between towers of glass. Inside, he remained still, his reflection caught in the darkened window beside the necklaces. Reflection, two images, the man he had to become, and the son he had never stopped being. A soft chime broke the silence. The vibration of his phone on the marble countertop. He glanced at the screen. It was his mother. Even now, decades into his success, he felt that same quiet respect whenever her name lit up his phone. "Hey, Ma," he answered, his voice softer than the one the world usually heard. Her voice, warm, yet weary, floated through the speaker. "I hope I'm not calling too late, sweetheart." No, never too late for you, he replied, sinking into a leather chair near the window. She spoke about her day doctor's visits, the neighbor's stubborn dog, a recipe she tried and burned. She asked about his work, whether he was eating properly, whether he was sleeping. She never asked about the diamonds or the headlines. She cared about him, not the empire he built. And in that gentle conversation, the weight he'd carried in the store that afternoon seemed to loosen, not disappear never completely but soften into something manageable. Ma, he said finally, his voice quieter still, I got you something today. Oh, you shouldn't be spoiling me, she chuckled, half scolding, half delighted. Just something I wanted you to have, he explained, the words stumbling under memories of the mockery that preceded the purchase. He didn't tell her what happened, because in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the necklace would rest against her skin, not the store's laughter, not their disbelief. I'm sure it's beautiful, she said, her voice tender. I'll bring it by tomorrow, he promised. They stayed on the phone a few minutes longer, her gentle goodnight lingering even after the call ended. He placed the phone next to the diamond box, as though the two belonged together, his love for her, and the symbol of it. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing slowly. The echoes of laughter from earlier faded further into the distance. He wasn't buying forgiveness for the world's prejudice. He was giving gratitude to the woman who taught him how to keep moving forward, no matter how the world tried to push him back. Night had already settled over the city by the time he left the boutique. The velvet box felt heavier than its size suggested, resting on the passenger seat beside him. He started the engine, the quiet purr of the luxury car blending into the distant hum of city traffic. Outside, neon signs glowed on rain-damp sidewalks. People moving under umbrellas, unaware of the story unfolding behind tinted windows. He drove without music. The silence felt necessary, a space to gather himself, to process what had happened and what it meant. At each red light, the diamond box caught reflections from passing headlights, flashing small rebellions of brilliance into the darkness. Those tiny bursts of light reminded him of something his mother used to say, even a single flame can soften the dark. His mind replayed the laughter, the sneers, the manager's disbelief, but also the way the cashier's hands trembled when she realized what was happening. He wondered whether she had seen him as a person then, or only as power, wielded in retaliation. The car moved steadily through city streets, past buildings that once felt close to him, past restaurants where he'd once been denied reservations, until someone recognized his name, each memory layered onto the next. Bitterness, resolve, and somewhere deep beneath them, hope. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. Don't let them make you hard, son. You fight, but don't let them steal your kindness. He thought of her, lying in bed, waiting for her next treatment, unaware of the stares and whispers her son faced just hours before. The necklace, he reminded himself, wasn't a trophy. It was love, wrapped in velvet. By the time he turned onto his block, the tension had eased. Not gone, but quieted. The city seemed softer, too, as if it recognized, in some small way, the journey he had made that day. He pulled into the driveway, cut the engine, and sat for a moment, breathing in the silence. Tomorrow, the story might spread viral headlines and online debates. But in this brief pause, he wasn't a CEO, or a symbol, or a headline. He was just a son, carrying a gift home. He stepped inside, the quiet click of the front door echoing through the hallway. The scent of chamomile tea drifted from the kitchen where his mother sometimes sat in the evenings, even when too tired to talk tonight. The light above the dining table was on, casting a warm pool that felt almost sacred. He placed the velvet box gently on the table. Just setting it down felt like the release of something heavy inside him. A burden shifted from his heart to the polished wood. For a moment, he only looked at it. Its simplicity, the rich black fabric, the sharp corners betrayed nothing of what lay inside. Not just the diamonds, but the meaning stitched into every carat. The laughter of the boutique staff replayed again, softer now, like an echo heard through a closed door. Their mockery had cut deep, yet it had also revealed something he couldn't deny, the quiet, stubborn part of him that refused to be small. He pictured his mother's face when she'd see the necklace, the soft exclamation of surprise, the shine in her tired eyes, and maybe, just maybe, the way her hand would drift to her chest as if to check her own heartbeat. That was why he'd bought it all, not for revenge, not for the shock it would send through a prejudiced staff, but because love demanded action, not excuses. And when the chance came to show her love, he'd chosen to do so boldly. In that quiet kitchen, the memory of the boutique felt distant. Here he was not the man they'd underestimated, not the man they'd later feared. Here, he was simply her son. He poured himself a glass of water, leaning against the counter. The tension he'd carried through the city had begun to dissolve, replaced by a softer Ica tiredness born of truth, not defeat. On the table, the box stayed closed. It didn't need to be opened yet. Its promise was enough. Tomorrow would come with headlines and questions, with praise and criticism. But tonight, there was only this moment. A gift resting in the quiet, waiting for a mother's smile. The house had fallen into a hush, broken only by the gentle tick of a clock on the wall. He stood by the window, city lights shimmering beyond the glass, when his phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. A hesitation, then he answered, "Hello." The voice on the other end was older, roughened by years, yet tinged with something close. "To apology, is this Mr. Grant? I saw the video." It was the boutique's senior partner, someone who hadn't been in the store that day, but whose name was carved into its very history. His words stumbled, weighted by discomfort. "I just wanted to say it shouldn't have happened. Not to you, not to anyone." The words weren't graceful. They came wrapped in self-preservation, mixed with genuine regret, a raw acknowledgement that took courage to offer. For a moment, the man considered hanging up. He had no duty to soothe another's guilt. But then, in the silence, he remembered why he had bought the diamonds, not as a final word of revenge, but as a testament that dignity isn't something others grant, it's something you claim. "I appreciate the call," he replied quietly. "I hope what happened becomes a lesson, not a headline." The man on the other end exhaled, as if releasing breath he'd held too long. "We single quotes changing things. Policies, training, not because of fear, but because you made us see." He nodded, unseen. It wasn't absolution, but it was a start. Before they ended the call, the partner asked, almost hesitantly, "Why did you really do it?" "Buy it all." He thought of the laughter, the heat in his chest, the sight of his mother's quiet resilience through illness. And he answered honestly, "Because love deserves more than silence." When the call ended, he stood still, phone in hand, letting the weight of the day settle. Outside, the city continued without pause, unaware of the small crack that had opened in an old, armored institution. A single conversation didn't rewrite history, but it planted something fragile, necessary into the story's soil. The possibility of growth. Morning light spilled across the polished floors of the penthouse, painting golden stripes over glass and steel. He rose early, sleep still tugging at his eyes, but curiosity stronger. Coffee in hand, he unlocked his phone and the world's reaction met him in bright, urgent letters. Black CEO silences discrimination by buying out entire diamond inventory. From mocked to magnate, viral clip sparks industry reckoning. What happened at Grant & Co.'s boutique? A lesson in power and principle. The stories weren't uniform, some breathless, some reflective, some searching for an angle. Yet all agreed on one thing. Something seismic had happened. And his name, once just another in the corporate directory, was now woven into millions of conversations. On social media, the clip had surpassed 5 million views overnight. Threads debated, praised, critiqued. Some hailed him as a hero, a symbol of rising above hate. Others questioned his methods, arguing that buying out a store was only possible because of wealth. Yet beneath every take was the same magnetic pull, a shared recognition of injustice so casually displayed, then answered by a gesture so read until the words blurred, phone warm in his palm. He wasn't immune to pride, but neither was he blind to why the story struck such a chord. For every viral clip, there were countless unseen human insinuations, indignities that ended in quiet resignation instead of public reckoning. The difference this time wasn't just money, it was visibility, timing, and the simple refusal to let silence have the final word. He refreshed the feed, new headlines stacking on old. In them, he saw not just his reflection, but the faces of countless others, men and women who'd walked into stores, meetings, lobbies, and felt the sting of doubt because of skin, clothes, accent, and he wondered, what if, by accident or intention, his story helped theirs be heard. He set down the phone and stared out over the city, the early sun glittering like the very diamonds that sparked it all. By midday, his inbox overflowed not with business memos, but with voices from around the world. Some messages were short, almost whispered confessions. "I've never had the courage to speak up when they followed me around the store. Thank you for doing what I couldn't." Others carried anger sharpened by decades. "They don't respect our money until we prove it's real, and even then, they still see us the same way. You forced them to look." There were parents writing on behalf of sons and daughters. "My teenage boy saw your video. He asked me why people laughed at you. Then he saw what you did next, and his shoulders lifted. Thank you for showing him we don't always have to bow our heads." And then came notes from unexpected places, door clerks, junior managers, even an executive from a competing luxury brand. "We've all seen it happen. Sometimes we're the ones doing it without realizing. Your story forced conversations we've avoided for too long." Some wrote with guilt, describing times they'd stayed silent rather than challenge a colleague, a policy, or a look that turned icy the moment the wrong customer walked in. And still others simply said, "I see you. I see what you did. Thank you." He read them all line by line, pausing when the words caught in his throat. These strangers, thousands of them, didn't know him, but they knew the experience behind the story, the tightening in the chest, the glance from security, the invisible price tag placed on dignity. By the time evening shadows stretched across his living room, he understood that the gesture, the buying, the silent defiance had become something larger. What began as a personal response had become a shared moment. Proof that injustice exposed can ripple far beyond the walls where it occurred. As twilight deepened, His phone rang with a number. He recognized from the corner of his memory a producer from a major business network. Her voice, polished yet urgent, skipped pleasantries. "We saw the video. People are talking about it everywhere. We want you on the show tomorrow. Prime time." He hesitated. He hadn't planned for this. No rehearsed talking points. No PR. Consultant smoothing edges. But the producer pressed on. "You don't have to defend anything. Just tell us what you saw, what you felt and why you responded the way you did. Viewers need to hear it from you, not the headlines." He agreed, almost without realizing. A part of him knew this was no longer about diamonds or a single insult. It was about something larger that had caught fire in the public imagination. After the call ended, he stood alone in his quiet office, the city's skyline glinting through the window. Beyond the glass, he could see countless other lights, offices, apartments, shops, each holding people whose stories might never be filmed, whose daily humiliations might remain unseen. He wasn't comfortable under a spotlight. His empire had grown quietly, built on numbers and negotiations, not public attention. Yet he sensed that stepping forward now wasn't about ego. It was about voice using the weight of his success to speak truths that were too often whispered or dismissed. He closed his eyes, centered his breath, and thought not of viewers or viral counts but of his mother, whose illness had first sent him into that store. She had taught him that silence can feel like safety, but sometimes silence is surrender. Night deepened around him, but he barely noticed. In his quiet study, the glow of a single lamp spilled across handwritten notes. Not a script. He refused to script his heart, but reminders of moments and truths he didn't want to forget. He thought about the laughter that had trailed him that afternoon, the casual cruelty delivered so effortlessly by the clerks. He wrote, not anger, clarity. Tell them what it felt like. Tell them why it matters. Then he listed names he remembered: mentors, former teachers, old colleagues, people whose encouragement had shaped his journey, often in silence. They'd reminded him, again and again, that dignity isn't something you request, it's something you claim. He practiced speaking aloud, his reflection watching from the window. This isn't about wealth. It's about the right of every person to walk into a store, an office, anywhere and be seen first as human. His voice cracked slightly, and he let it. He knew vulnerability would speak louder than polished confidence. Near midnight, a message arrived from his oldest friend. Don't talk about numbers, talk about her. Your mother? He smiled. Of course. The real story didn't start at the store. It started years ago in quiet hospital rooms, in late-night phone calls, in the trembling hope that one gift might lift her spirits, if only for a day. Before bed, he gathered the diamond necklace once again, feeling its cool weight, not as proof of power, but as a reminder of purpose. Tomorrow, cameras would glare and questions would come sharp, but he would answer softly, firmly, from the only place that mattered, the truth he carried inside. Morning arrived, draped in anticipation. As he stepped onto the sidewalk outside the network studio, camera lenses turned like sunflowers following light. A hush fell, not the silence of respect yet, but of curiosity sharpened by scandal. Inside, the air buzzed with the clipped words of producers and the shuffle of scripts. He took his seat opposite the host, the bright studio lights glaring down. The necklace lay before him on the table, not a trophy, but a testament. The first question came, soft but edged. Why didn't you reveal who you were immediately? He paused, inhaling the hush around him. Because who I am shouldn't have mattered, he said, and yet, somehow, it mattered to them the moment they chose to mock me. A flicker crossed the host's expression, a ripple of recognition. The audience leaned closer, drawn not by anger, but by the measured calm in his voice. Another question, was this revenge? Buying the diamonds and closing the store? His gaze steadied, words deliberate. No, it was a statement that disrespect costs more than anyone realizes, and that sometimes change requires consequence. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged looks. This wasn't outrage. It was deeper, a man inviting the world to see the difference between justice and vengeance. He spoke of his mother, not of illness, but of the grace she carried in sickness, of how, even on her hardest days, she taught him that dignity isn't given by others. It's claimed from within. At the end, the host asked quietly, what do you hope people learn from this? His answer was gentle, unhurried, that it shouldn't take wealth, or power, or cameras for someone to be treated with basic human decency. In that moment, something shifted. The story was no longer about diamonds, money, or even human. It was about a universal desire to be seen, respected, and valued, just as you are. Long after the cameras turned away, the real impact began. Social media overflowed with debate, anger, and unexpected gratitude. Hashtags trended not only about the diamonds, but about dignity and unseen injustice. Messages arrived by the hundreds. Your story gave me courage to speak about what happened to me. I never thought someone with your success could still face this. Thank you for showing it's possible to answer hate without hate. In boardrooms, executives discussed bias training not as a checkbox, but as urgent necessity. In classrooms, teachers brought up his interview to spark discussion about unconscious prejudice. Young entrepreneurs shared how his calm resolve, showed strength isn't always loud and in quiet corners. Where real change always begins, strangers began to question their own assumptions. Would I have laughed too? Do I look twice before offering respect? Even in the luxury retail industry, whispers grew louder. If it could happen to someone like him, it could happen to anyone. Maybe it's time we rethink who we're really serving. He watched all this unfold, not with pride, but with measured hope. For change seeded by pain can still bloom into something worthy. At night, he still thought of that moment in the store, the laughter, the glances, the weight in his chest. But what echoed louder now were the voices of those inspired to see, to question, and to do better. The ripples, once invisible, had become waves. Months passed, the headlines faded. The viral clips became old news, replaced by new stories. But some legacies don't need trending hashtags to endure. Inside that once hostile diamond store, policies changed. Anonymous customer surveys, staff workshops, mentorships for young employees of color. A framed quote from him now hung quietly. Behind the counter, respect isn't luxury, it's the baseline. Beyond retail, the story took on a life of its own. Universities used it as a case study on implicit bias and the power of quiet resistance. Leadership seminars invited him to speak about dignity as a strategic choice, not just a moral one. The necklace he had chosen for his mother, delicate, shimmering, chosen with love, remained her most treasured gift, not for its price, but for what it meant. A son who refused to let humiliation define his spirit. Through foundations, he funded scholarships for first-generation college students, especially those studying business, ethics, and social justice. He partnered with civil rights groups to track retail discrimination nationwide, turning a single incident into a tool for systemic change. Yet when asked about the moment he bought the entire inventory, he would always say, it was never about the diamonds, it was about dignity, and reminding them, and myself, that no one's worth should be decided by appearance. And perhaps the deepest legacy was invisible. The quiet conversations between fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, friends and colleagues, all asking themselves, how would I have acted in that moment? In these countless private reckonings, beyond news cycles and viral views, true change took root. And somewhere in a quiet office, under softer lights, a man who once stood silently mocked by laughter now stood, quietly remembered for something far greater, not the wealth he spent, but the wisdom he shared. This story isn't just about one man's choice to stand tall in the face of mockery. It's about every silent moment where dignity is tested, about every store aisle, office hallway, or boardroom where someone is judged by skin color, clothes, accent, or past. It asks us all a question. When the laughter dies down, when the moment to speak or act arrives, what will you do? Will you join the quiet revolution of everyday courage? Will you challenge that offhand joke, that suspicious glance, that policy that quietly excludes? Will you listen when someone says, "This hurt me," even if it makes you uncomfortable? Real change isn't born from viral videos alone. It comes from small, steady choices. Welcoming the customer who doesn't look like your typical client, hiring for potential, not just pedigree, measuring success not just by profit, but by the respect you show. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it with your friends, family, and colleagues. Reflect on the unseen biases that might live in your own heart, your workplace, your community. And above all, choose respect. Choose inclusion. Choose to see the human before the label, because sometimes the most valuable thing in the room isn't what's locked behind glasses, the person standing quietly in front of it. They saw a hoodie. He saw his mother's smile. They saw cheap shoes. He saw priceless memories. In the end, what we see in others says more about us than them. Look deeper. Subscribe for more real-life stories that reveal hidden worth. Share to keep these conversations alive.